Honest dissent must only enrich us. When we question authority, no matter how righteous, what if it's wrong? Let's set it right. Studs Terkel says we have national Alzheimer's disease. No memory of the past. We learn no lessons from history.
Thank you for gathering to celebrate Studs Terkel's 100th birthday. May we all continue to honor Studs' life and work, and together as a community accomplish something. Happy birthday, Studs. Before we move on to the program, I want to let you know just a few housekeeping items. There's going to be a takeaway gift. Hopefully we have enough for all of you. This is a commemorative book of Studs ephemera that artists and writers have contributed to, and it's provided by Megan McGrath and by Chicago Publishes. I now want to introduce John Fritchie, a Chicago native with strong local ties. Cook County Commissioner John Fritchie currently represents the 12th District on the Cook County Board. Prior to joining the board, he was a state representative for 14 years. He also, we're pleased to say, has been a longtime supporter of the Newberry and has even participated in our Bughouse Square debates. John?
You know, when I walked in, Rick Cogan thanked me for being here, and I told him there's very few perks left in my job. This has got to be one of the coolest ones. To give an idea of just how cool something like this is to do, I've got a 16-year-old daughter. And for any of you that have or have had teenagers, you'll know that they find very few things that you do at work to be interesting. And you know, these days, unless it involves me getting her Lala tickets, she really wants nothing to do with it. But I talked to her earlier this afternoon, and I told her what I was doing, and she's like, "Oh my God, that's the coolest thing you've ever done." Now, keep in mind, Studs was 84 years old when she was born. And for him to have that kind of impact on a 16-year-old, let alone the impact that he's had on us or our parents, that speaks more volumes than most anything else you can attribute to him. You know, Chicago gets defined by maybe our politics, our sports figures, a lot of the things that go on in this city. But 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, you're not going to be able to watch a game film of Michael Jordan and get a sense of what Chicago was really like. But you can pick up almost anything that Studs Terkel wrote or listen to any of his shows, and it'll give you a window into Chicago like none other. And that is why we're here today. I think that's why we have the opportunity to honor somebody that defines Chicago and is as much a part of Chicago as we were a part of him. That being said, I've got a privilege today to read a proclamation from Governor Pat Quinn. The governor has a couple other items keeping him a little busy down in Springfield right now, and he regrets not being able to be here, but I know he was very proud to be able to partake in this ceremony today and in declaring today what it is. So that being said, and I wish this was 10 years ago because I could have read this somewhat easier, but that being said, let me read the words from the governor's proclamation. Whereas May 16th, 2012 marks what would have been the 100th birthday of Louis Studs Terkel, one of Chicago and Illinois' most respected residents. And whereas Studs Terkel was a man who lived a life of civic engagement and activism and was known throughout the world as a great author of American life, an extraordinary historian, actor, and broadcaster whose chronicles of history came from the voices of people he interviewed. And whereas Studs Terkel was born in New York City, but moved to Chicago in 1923 at the age of 8, and later with his wife Ida Goldberg and son Dan, made Chicago, Illinois his home. Terkel graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, was later honored with a Pulitzer Prize, and eventually forged a career as an author, actor, and activist. He died at home on October 31st, 2008 at the age of 96. And whereas Studs Terkel was best remembered as a prolific author and for his oral histories of common Americans, including the books Giants of Jazz, Division Street, Hard Times, Working, American Dreams, The Good War, The Great Divide, Race, Coming of Age, My American Century, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, Hope Dies Last, The Spectator, Touch and Go, Talking to Myself, P.S. Further Thoughts from a Lifetime of Listening, They All Sang, and Studs Terkel Chicago. And whereas Studs Terkel contributed to the cultural development of our state as a playwright, jazz critic, and host of WFMT's The Studs Terkel program for 45 years. He was also the central character in Studs Place, considered a canonical example of the Chicago School of Television. He was known as a gifted listener with the ability to engage others in spontaneous, revealing interviews. And whereas Studs Terkel was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and his work lives on in countless theatrical plays of working in the 7,000 audio tapes at the Chicago History Museum and the Library of Congress, quote, as a remarkably rich history of the ideas and perspective of both common and influential people living in the second half of the 20th century, close quote, and whose museum president states, for Studs, there was not a voice that should not be heard, a story that could not be told. He believed that everyone had the right to be heard and had something important to say. And whereas Studs Terkel's Division Street America was his first book of oral history, Division Street America recorded the hopes and opinions of Americans of all walks of life along Division Street in the city of Chicago. And according to the author, Division Street represents a metaphor of the divisions within each of us and the social divisions that separate us from each other. And whereas Illinois architectural and urban design students will participate in the Studs Terkel Division Street Bridge contest by submitting their future visions to redesign the new Division Street Bridge. They represent true examples of Studs Terkel sentiment that once you become active in something, something happens to you, you get excited, and you suddenly realize you count. And therefore, I, Pat Quinn, Governor of the State of Illinois, do hereby proclaim May 16, 2012, as Studs Terkel Day, in honor of the centennial anniversary of Studs Terkel's 100th birthday, and upon all citizens to celebrate civic activism, to promote the arts and culture in the land of Lincoln in memory of Studs Terkel. We will never find an elected official that could put into words the capture of life that Studs Terkel not just put into words himself, but embodied himself. But the words of the governor should echo into all of us, not just to understand and read the works that Stud put together, but to really know why he did it and what they meant. And they weren't just so much a dialogue of the city, but a call to action for what each of the people in this city can be. So I hope in that memory we keep Studs Terkel in all of our memories. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Fritchie. Most of you know our host, Rick Kogan. What you may not know is that Rick's father, legendary Chicago journalist Herman Kogan, was for decades one of Studs' closest friends. In fact, it was Studs who took Herman out for a drink the day Rick was born. We're proud to be the resting place for Herman Kogan's papers, and proud now to introduce his son and tonight's Master of Ceremonies, Rick Kogan.
This is really a Studs crowd, isn't it? A few walkers, some canes, a lot of white hair. Some of you are probably deaf, and I hope you enjoy. An hour ago in Washington Square Park, otherwise known as Bughouse Square, as I always do when I'm in the neighborhood, I go to visit Studs and Ida, who were buried. They weren't scattered. They were buried underneath a tree. And when I was out there an hour ago, there were all these little kids tied together by a rope playing around that tree. And I thought, they don't know Studs is in there. They don't know lovely Ida's in there. But maybe they're getting something out of this. This is a map that is being sold here by the Terkel Committee, of which I'm a member. It's $10. You should not leave without one. Well, what I want those of you with money to promise me is that when you leave, or tomorrow, or sometime over this crazy weekend, buy one of Studs' books and give it to someone young. I don't care what book it is. Give it to someone young. He has influenced many people in this room, but his influence has to continue on. You're in for a lot of fun tonight. There are a lot of interesting people here, some more interesting than others. Whereas, John Fritchie's a good guy, but you know, these proclamations, I'm up to here with proclamations. Studs inspired the StoryCorps. You know what that is. It's independent, non-for-profit, goes around America and talks to people, records and shares and preserves our stories. This video you're about to see brings Studs back to life. I first saw it when it was part of Facet's Children's Film Festival. It is beyond charming.
What has happened to the human voice? Vox humana, hollering, shouting, quiet, talking, buzz. I was leaving the airport, this is in Atlanta. You know, you leave the gate, you take a train that took you to a concourse of your choice, and I get into this train, dead silence, few people seated, all standing. Up above you hear a voice that once was a human voice, but no longer. Now it talks like a machine. Concourse 1, Fort Worth, Dallas, Lubbock, that kind of voice. Just when the doors are about to close, pneumatic doors, when a young couple rush in and push open the doors and get in. Without missing a beat, that voice above says, because of late entry, we delayed 30 seconds. The people looked at that couple. That couple just committed mass murder, you know. And the couple is shrinking like this, you know. And I'm known for my talking. I'm Gabby. And so I say, George Orwell, your time has come and gone. I expect a laugh. Dead silence. And now they look at me. And I'm with the couple, the three of us, at the Hill of Calvary on Good Friday. And then I say, my God, where's the human voice? And just then there's a little baby. Maybe the baby's about a year old or something. And I say, sir or madam, to the baby, what is your opinion of the human species? Well, what does a baby do? Baby starts giggling. I say, thank God, the sound of a human voice.
Thanks all of you for coming out. Wow, this is great. It's wonderful to see all of you. I have to admit, I am nervous as hell. I knew I was going to have to follow Rick Cogan, who, if we do decide to anoint Studs Terkel of the 21st century, I'm pretty sure he's at the front of the line, and Alex Kotlowitz, who's coming up next, is not far behind him. But I didn't know that I was going to actually have to follow Studs as well. I do feel like a bit of an interloper here. I never sat down and drank with Studs. I'm pretty sure he would have martinied me under the table had I done so. I moved to Chicago in 1999, and I started working at WBEZ in 2001. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Studs Terkel was a living legend for me. He was one of my heroes, Division Street America, which, Rick, you'll be happy to know I gave to my niece this past Christmas as one of her gifts. But that was the first major work of documentary that I encountered in my teen years. And I say that as someone who grew up in Canada, where we're forced to watch wildlife documentaries, not only at school, but when we go to the movies. I mean, in Canada, you know, that's our cartoon, a documentary about duck habitats. So I'd seen a lot of documentary, but I'd never seen or read anything like Division Street America and then working, and I just could not believe that, A, someone could go out. I think Studs puts it as a man on an adventure armed with a tape recorder and badgered by that imp curiosity could go out, do this, and someone would put it in a book, and then we could all read it and enjoy it and share it. So he was this mythic figure. So I arrive at WBEZ, and at that point, Studs was kind of the property of Tish Valva. She was then the executive producer of 848, and she would entertain Studs at the station. He'd come and hang out in her office, and then she'd kind of chaperone him around, you know. And you could always tell when Studs was in the building. You know, when someone important shows up to work and you get that kind of buzz happening in the room, and then I'd poke my head out the office and I'd see the glimpse of red, you know, the checkered shirt and the bright red socks, and know he was there, and everyone would collect around him. But it struck me that here is this guy, this legend, and he's being kind of led around like he's the favored elder uncle, you know, at a family gathering, and he's meeting the new nieces and nephews, the new grandnieces and nephews, and, you know, catching up on what's going on, keeping his ear to the ground even then. And he reminded me a lot of one of my uncles when I was growing up. I don't think he actually was my uncle. I spent almost every weekend with my grandmother growing up, and every day at 10 o'clock, she would put on this kettle for tea, and then out of the woods that surrounded her property would emerge Uncle Art, this kind of enormous, tall, face etched in stone. He was like an Ent out of Lord of the Rings. He would come out of the woods and come into our house and sit down, drink tea, play a few hands of cribbage, and I would just sit there trying to pick up the tips of the game, but also mesmerized by this man. You know, I wasn't scared of him or anything, but I just felt like, who is this man? I mean, what does he know? He must have been alive during the First World War, which was a big war in Canada, you know. He must have been alive during the Depression. And he was a man of few words. I can count on both my hands how many words he would say over the course of, you know, dozens and dozens of cribbage games. So he just lit my curiosity. How could I get those stories out of him? How could I learn what he learned? And I thought of Studs as someone like that, and he wasn't the only one at WBEZ. When I started there, there was Dick Buckley, the narcoleptic late-night jazz host. And if Studs had that kind of scuttling, crab-like walk, you know, as he went along, Dick kind of ambled like he'd never broken a sweat for anybody. And then the third wise uncle, was Larry Smith, who was also a jazz DJ and kind of would saunter down the hall. He wore this oversized newsboy cap and a sharp polyester suit, and he'd hail everybody who went by. And it was that same thing. Here I am just walking down the hallway at work, and these men who contain so much history, who have such amazing stories, who long precede me in time and place. I'm like kind of brushing, you know, elbows with them. And they're all gone now. You know, none of them are here anymore at WBEZ. But it's funny, they've all been on my mind lately, because we're thinking a lot about reinventing radio and how we engage with community and who the community is. And, you know, I know Studs is a really important model for that. That idea of just sitting down with somebody, having a conversation with them, and getting their story, their history, their sense of their place in history out of them. But, you know, as great as what I think we do is at WBEZ, someone like Studs or Dick or Larry, that's not something that you can just recreate, you know. It takes talent, mad talent, and skill. It takes an incredible amount of intelligence for someone like Studs to be able to bridge, you know, the kind of everyday people from all walks of life, but also the amazing intellects of his day, and bring them all together in that same kind of conversation. I mean, that takes something that speaks to experience and history. It's about character and personality, and those three were characters that I miss every day. You know, we live in a moment in which I agree with Rick and with the commissioner that we're not out of touch with Studs. I think he's still meaningful to us, but you know, if you want to know someone's history nowadays, all you have to do is friend them on Facebook and then just rifle through their timeline. It's all there. We're very transparent about who we are and what we've done, but we don't sit down and talk the way that Studs got people to sit down and talk, you know, just chew the fat. So I just wanted to say, I hope that's not Studs. Sorry. That I appreciate it. I can't stop. Maybe I'll just wind up by saying I appreciate the opportunity to meet Studs in the limited way I did, and I missed him every day, and I want to wish him a very, very happy 100th birthday. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. That wasn't Studs making that noise. Can you all hear me? Is this mic working? Yeah. Well, maybe you're deaf. Maybe you've just gone deaf, and that's why you can't hear me. I don't want anybody to get suspicious about my new relationship with Alex Kotlowitz. We sat together at the world premiere of John Conroy's astonishing play, My Kind of Town, at Timeline Theater, which you have to see. All those years of work manifesting itself in a compelling, chilling play. Then today we spend 2 hours yammering on Steve Edwards' afternoon shift at WBZ. And here he is again. Filmmaker, journalist, author, Wednesday afternoon radio star, Alex Kotlowitz.
What a remarkable turnout. I got to tell you, though, when I learned that we were going to be on for 2 hours, I panicked, and then I was so relieved when I realized I was on with Rick. Because Rick is really, Rick, you're the city's finest storyteller, so I knew I was in good hands and that there'd be, you know, a number of years ago, my son, who at the time was probably around, I want to probably say around 5 or so, met Studs, and I think like any kid, he was kind of enamored with him. I mean, here's this guy, his hair all out of whack, you know, his checkered shirts, the Red Sox, and my son later said to me, so, Dad, what does he do? What does he do? Who is he? And I didn't know how to answer that question. I mean, when I think about it, I mean, Studs is kind of the cultural equivalent of Bo Jackson. You know, he's an actor, a radio DJ, a journalist, rabble-rouser, historian. There was a moment years ago when he had Margot Fontaine, the ballerina, on his show, and afterwards she was clearly smitten with him, and afterwards she said, you know, Mr. Terkel, I think in your heart you're a dancer, and it was yet one more way to describe him. My favorite description of him, though, was how he described himself, which was as a guerrilla journalist. And that's what he was. I mean, he spent time in places that most of the people wouldn't bother to hang out in. I have no doubt that were he here with us today, that he'd be out there this weekend and on Monday, and he'd be out there listening to people, talking to people, and rabble-rousing a bit. So you know, one of the things I admired about Studs is Studs was always in the moment. If anybody knew him, he was just always engaged with the world, engaged with whoever was in front of him. And back in 2004, when he was 94, is that right? 92. He was in the hospital. He had had heart surgery, and I went to visit him, and he was in his bed, and he was looking pretty wan. He was pale. He didn't look all that great, and I think a lot of people, myself included, weren't sure he'd make it through. He was lying in his bed, his Red Sox sticking out from the sheets, and Studs says to me, "How's it looking? How's it looking?" And I, you know, gritted my teeth and I lied. I said, "Studs, you know, you're looking okay. I think you're going to do okay." He says, "Not me, the elections. How's the elections going?" It was real. And then he told me his nurse and his cardiologist, he learned, were both supporters of Bush. And so Studs, in perfect Studs fashion, but he didn't yell at them, he didn't cajole them, he didn't push them. He asked questions. Why are you voting for him? What would it take you to change your vote? And that was Studs. You know, there was so much to admire in the guy. I mean, I think we would like to glibly say that he taught us to listen, but you know, the thing about Studs is he says in this animated part, he was gabby. Anybody knew him, he didn't shut up. And it was hard to imagine him listening. And what I came to realize is that the thing about Studs is he wasn't a passive listener. You know, he engaged with people, he pushed back, he asked questions. And it's what made his work, in the end, so powerful, so revelatory. And not only revelatory to us, but revelatory to the people he was interviewing. He always would tell the story, back in the late 1960s, he interviewed a woman living in the projects on the west side of Chicago. And after he was done, she asked if she could hear the tape. And so he rewound the tape and played it for her, and she listened real intently. And afterwards, she said to him, she said, "You know, I never knew I felt that way." And that's what his work did, is it revealed people to themselves. He was also a guy of incredibly generous spirit. I mean, anybody who knew, you'd always go to his house. He'd have piles of manuscripts that had been sent to him by young writers, including myself. and he read every one of them. And in fact, on the way to the hospital, back in '94, one of the EMTs in the ambulance was telling Studs that he was working on a novel and was excited. And Studs, and this is the God's honest truth, Studs said, send it to me. I'd love to take a look at it. I'll take a look. And the other thing is that he was a guy who just cut through the bullshit. The story I always remember is when Dennis Kucinich was running for president. Kucinich, who knew Studs, stopped by to see him, and Studs said, "How's it going?" And Dennis gave him the rap. It's looking good. I think we've got a shot. And Studs turns to him and goes, "Dennis, you're talking to me." Studs had incredible influence on my work, in my radio, in my film, in my writing, and more than that, he was just an incredible friend. I mean, I really miss him. He would call me regularly, more than my agent, and always say to me, "What are you working on? What are you working on?" And if I was between projects, he said, "You need to come by, you need to come by, you need to come by." He was just a guy who really cared, and he was as loyal a friend as one could ask for. I want to end by reading just a very short thing that Studs said many years ago, and it's actually something I use not infrequently in speeches. In fact, I just used it to close a commencement speech at the UIC School of Public Health. And I do it with some reticence. Studs told me at one point that he used to, and I can't remember what it was that he quoted, but he used to use a quote of William Sloane Coffins, the former chaplain at Yale. And he used it so many times that people began to attribute it to Studs. And I worry that I've used this so much that they're going to begin to attribute it to me. So with apologies to Studs, let me read you this. Studs once said, "My goal is to survive the day, to survive it with a semblance of grace, curiosity, and a sense I've done something pretty good. I can't survive the day unless everyone else survives it too. I live in a community, and if the community isn't in good shape, neither am I." And that's how it should be for all of us. Thanks.
Before we carry on a few bits of business, turn off your phones. Any of you standing, getting in this bottleneck over here, feel free to walk behind me, and there's a little room over there by the windows. Also, Alex mentioned his film, kind of self-effacingly. His film is called The Interrupters, a documentary about efforts to stop violence in the South Side. If you have not seen it, you have to see it. And know, too, that the current and first issue of a magazine called The Chicagoan, published by J.C. Gable here, has a long piece about that. Also, Alex and I, our relationship goes on, are helping Don Evans, the guy in the hat back there, get a new class for the Literary Hall of Fame, Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. Studs is already in, Mike's in. Now we're down to goose like me and Alex. But I think we have to be dead, right? You have to be dead to get in? Well, you never know. Studs was born in 1912, and I think in wonderful kind of biological symmetry, another man was born in 1912. He was a singer, and he wrote a note to Studs in 1940. Sent a telegram to his wife in 1947, saying, "Dear honey," I can't do his voice, "I made it to Chicago safe. I'm staying at the home of my friend Studs Terkel." That man was Woody Guthrie. And there is no greater interpreter, historian, or performer about Guthrie and about a lot of other things too. Ladies and gentlemen, Bucky Halker.
I'm Jamie O'Reilly. Hey. People have many chapters in their lives, and if you're lucky, like Studs was, to live a long time, as people have been saying, you make friends with the young people. And Studs was not only a good listener, he asked you the good questions. If you're an artist like me, he also told you about your work and why your work mattered and why you should do it. And he told me about this song. This song was sung by Albert Parsons in his prison cell the night before he died. And I would sing it for Studs, and I'm singing it again for him today. Maxwell sprays are bonny when early fells the dew, and 'twas there that Annie Laurie gave me her promise true, gave me her promise true, which ne'er forgot shall be. And for bonny Annie Laurie I'd lay me down and dee. Her brow is like a snowdrift, her neck it's like a swan, and her face, it is the fairest that e'er the sun shone on, that e'er the sun shone on, and dark blue is her eye, and for bonny Annie Laurie I'd lay me down and dee. Like dew on the garden lying is the fall of her fairy feet, and like wind in summer sighing, her voice is low and sweet. Her voice is low and sweet, and she's all the world to me. And for bonny Annie Laurie I'd lay me down and dee.
Well, for a guy who never played that song before, Jamie always sings beautifully, but Bucky, that was good. Bucky is also a member of the Illinois Labor History Society. Well, of course he is, and that's they've generously helped fund this party, a guy named Larry Spivak. Let's hear from another member. You all know Larry? That's good. This is a Studs crowd. Another member of that society is my pal, Penny Rosemont. Penny? Stagehands Union.
Oops. Where is that Stagehands Union when I need that? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, Studs said, I have, after a fashion, been celebrated for having celebrated the lives of the uncelebrated among us, for lending a voice to the face in the crowd. But in fact, the people that he interviewed, making their everyday choices, determine history. And so none of these people were insignificant, and none of our lives were always making choices every day about what ultimately will determine what happens. Now, I really didn't know Studs until 1986, and that was the 100th anniversary of Haymarket, and also the 100th anniversary of the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company, which we were active in. Franklin Rosemont and I and David Roediger were working frantically to put together the Haymarket scrapbook in time for May 1st. There were many times we worked all night. We just managed to get it printed before May Day, but it was a big success. Well, Studs really liked this scrapbook. He called it a marvelous, massive, very important book. And also at this time, the Newberry had acquired the Charles H. Kerr Company's archives, and we had an event here. The Kerr Company was featured in a big front page article in the Reader. Wobbly activist Fred Thompson's photo was on the cover. It was enthusiastically written by Alan Moss. So when we arrived, the place here was pretty packed. And the speakers were nervous. We hadn't put together speeches. We didn't have any speaking order planned. Studs just took charge. "Don't worry," he said, "I'll take care of everything." Well, Studs was impeccably dressed in a suit and looked very businesslike. But when he sat down, you see, he was wearing his bright red socks. He did take care of everything. The speakers, David Roediger, Franklin Rosemont, Virgil Vogel, shined with Studs' encouragement. He also gave us a quote we could use in our catalogs and publicity. "The Charles H. Kerr Company is a truly extraordinary example of living history. Here is a publisher of Jean Debs, Clarence Darrow, Mother Jones, Jack London, Carl Sandburg, and hundreds of other outstanding figures, still at it, still fighting the good fight after 100 glorious years. The American labor movement has a great heritage, and the Charles H. Kerr Publishing Company is a precious part of it. It deserves every support." Well, we'd used this on a big sign up at Printers Row Book Fair, and it worked like a charm. People would come by, read the quote, look at the bottom, it said Studs Terkel. They'd pile up all the books on Chicago and buy them. And Studs did a program with Kerr Company in celebration of Honey Boy Edwards and the publication of another one of our titles by Paul Guerin, "What's the Use of Walking If There's a Freight Train Going Your Way?" Studs and Honey Boy were both quite up there in age, but they stole the show. And of course, we wanted them to. Now, Studs had been in radio, and he had a very evocative voice. He'd played gangsters, and I'm sure I heard him when I was growing up, because listening to the radio was a big part of our lives before TV and computers and Facebook. And Studs would introduce the debates here in the square. He'd set the stage, so to speak, with his voice, and you'd really be anticipating what would come. He'd talk about the great characters that spoke at the square. He'd point in his director of reality manner, and over there, on that corner, would be one-armed Charlie Wendorf. He'd lost his arm in the First World War. And then he'd point over, and on that corner would be Sister Grace with her sweet voice trying to save your soul. And in a moment, they'd be standing there. They'd be right there before you, along with Ben Reitman and Lucy Parsons and the other great people of Bughouse Square. So the magic of the imagination had been put into action, and everyone would be delighted. We'd think, oh, if only we'd lived back then when they had such great characters. But I've thought about this lately, about the aura of distance in history. And I thought about the Bughouse Square debates and Len Dupre, Chicago's crusading alderman, and Carlos Cortez, wobbly poet, woodblock artist. And I thought about Studs himself, his long career, his generosity with his time. And I realized Chicago in our time had great characters, and I had the pleasure of knowing them. And one of the very greatest of Chicago's great characters was Studs Terkel himself. Still, the great thing about being a writer is you're never really gone. All you need to do is open up one of Studs Terkel's books, and he's right there before you. So I'd like to say, Studs, congratulations on a life very well lived.
That was lovely, Pam. Lovely. She mentioned Charles Kerr and Company. They're also one of the sponsors, helpers of this thing. I don't know much about that kind of business stuff, but it's fascinating. They published the same year of the Haymarket. Someone who knows that history well is our next guest, the aforementioned University of Illinois professor David Roediger.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really glad you're all here. What I'm going to say a little bit about Studs as a person of the left, and then a little bit about Studs as a historian. And the first part is really going to be kind of a little bit of a postscript to what Penny just said. It also describes Studs' activities with the Kerr Company when, at that time, we were younger folks, Penny and I once, and Franklin took over the Kerr Company and tried to revitalize it. We were less than broke, and we started this group called the Friends of the Charles H. Kerr Company. And we were surprised, I was surprised anyway, that the people that we asked that we thought were kind of the longest long shots were our best friends. So people like Studs, like Jack Conroy, like Meridel Lesueur, like Stephen Jay Gould, like Noam Chomsky, all of those people who had a tremendous amount of cachet in the mainstream publishing world, who had radio shows, who had jobs at Harvard, who had access to all of the big media that might have warned them off of supporting a little struggling left venture like the Kerr Company, actually were our best supporters. And I particularly thought that that was significant in Studs' case. And I think it said something also about what kind of a person of the left that he was. He didn't have political agreement with us in any kind of big way. We benefited from his and our nostalgia for Chicago's radical past, and certainly he supported us for that reason. But also I think that he was the kind of a person who, from a left position, didn't need to be the most left person in the room, didn't need to think that he was somehow defining the left wing of the possible, thought that there might be good ideas coming at him from the left. And this point about him being gabby and also a great listener, this was particularly true when he was around old left figures. I remember H.L. Mitchell, the Southern Tenant Farmer organizer, and Studs at a table once, and it was the quietest I ever saw Studs. He was just taking in the great stories of H.L. Mitchell. The story I want to tell about history is one that maybe we can get some clarification on, because I've heard it in different ways. Of course, as a historian and somebody who once in a while did oral history, I asked Studs when I first met him, how do you do it? How do you get people to do what you do? And he said, well, I can't run the tape recorder. In fact, I thought the technology problems we had at the beginning might have been some kind of attempt to channel that aspect of Studs. He said, I can't run the tape recorder, and people start feeling sorry for me, and therefore they open up to me. And I've heard since that story, and some of you have probably heard it, told as I faked not knowing how to run the tape recorder over a period of many, many decades. I'm technophobic enough that I can even believe the first one, that he never quite mastered it. But whenever you get a story like that in oral history and oral tradition that gets repeated over and over and changed a little bit, it's saying something more than it's saying on the surface. And I think what that story is saying is that Studs always picked huge topics. Race in Chicago, can you imagine? In an oral history of race in Chicago when he did it. Class division, social boundaries in a city, aging, dying. Big topics that he had to invite people in. And he had to not make any pretense that he had figured out. That he wanted a conversation that wasn't going to have a set conclusion. And I think the adjectives curious and intelligent for Studs that were used in the clip and then in one of the talks, I think that those are right on the mark, but I think that the further genius was that he always knew that his informants were curious and intelligent people like himself. Thanks.
two guys. Anybody remember the name of the restaurant at the corner of Halsted and Randolph? Thank God. I thought you were as senile as I am. Yes, sir, Senator. Remember that? These two young men who were coming up here next have sort of planted a literary flag there. The Drinking and Writing Theater puts on shows in the back of that legendary old place. They also give awards every once in a while. The second award for drinking and writing went to me. I am so pleased that my mother and father were both dead when that happened. It's my great pleasure to welcome two really good friends, Sean Benjamin and Steve Mosqueda.
Hey, can we get a musical genre from you guys? Quickly. Music, hip hop, I heard. And
We got a play from Shakespeare. Macbeth. I heard Macbeth.
Macbeth and hip hop.
Macbeth and hip hop. Macbeth and hip hop.
You know, it'd be totally cool if someone could take those two and combine them and do a scene. But we're here to talk about Studs Terkel. And specifically, we're here to talk about Studs Place, which was actually an improvised TV show that aired from like 1949 to 1951.
Who saw that? Anybody saw that?
Yeah, I saw that.
Sorry.
I saw that. Yeah. But we're going to talk about that because we're from the Drinking and Writing Theater. And Steve, tell them about the Drinking and Writing Theater.
The Drinking and Writing Theater, our mission is to explore the connection between creativity and alcohol. Can we get 2 beers up here?
Our theater is actually in the back of the Haymarket Pub and Brewery, which is Barney's. And they're back there serving beer and food, so we're going to take a couple of beers right now.
Yes.
Studs would have wanted that.
Yes.
And if he wouldn't, we do.
And we write and perform original plays that explore this connection, but we also we have an event every year. It's called the Drinking and Writing Festival, and as Rick was saying, that we give out an award called the Drinking and Writing Outstanding Achievement in Drinking and Writing Award to a special writer. And in the past, we've given it to Rick Hogan. We've given it to Studs Terkel. His son showed up and accepted the award. We've given it to various other writers.
Bill Jows.
Bill Jows. Anybody know Bill Jows? The famous sports writer. We've given it to him.
Look at
wow.
that.
Look at that. Johnny
Look
on
at
the spot. Thank you very much. We only have 3 minutes, so this will be gone in 3 minutes. Yeah, so that's basically the kind of stuff that we do.
But we want to talk about Studs.
Yes,
Studs gave a voice to the everyday people. And what we do at the Drinking and Writing Theaters, we take Studs' voice and Royko and Nelson Algren and all those great writers, and we continue their voice.
Yes.
We want that to continue on. And I know everybody here is like, well, we all know Studs, we all know Royko, we all know Algren. But every day in this city, young people move here, and they're stupid. They do not know anything. Our job is to educate these stupid young people and continue. Yes, stupid people. And we want to continue that on. So in another 100 years, Studs has a 200-year birthday party.
Right here, 200 years. I won't be here, but you will.
We're all about making people less stupid while at the same time drinking and making us more stupid.
Yes.
Drinking and Writing came from the same school as Studs did. We're from improv. Steve, tell them a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've done improv here in the city for a long time. I actually took classes with Doug Close for a whole year. I learned a lot from Doug Close, but yeah, so we've done improv at Improv Olympics, Second City. So we've been around and we drank with a lot of them.
So we don't know what's going to happen next. So what we want you to do now is give us an occupation, any occupation, throw it out. A lawyer. Studs was actually, he did go to law school. I was going to say wasn't a lawyer. He did go to law school, but he had trouble passing a bar, I believe. But that's okay. But not passing a bar, the bar. He didn't have trouble passing a bar at all. In the late 40s and the early 50s, Studs had a TV show. And right now we're going to ask you for a location.
Yeah, give me a location.
Division Street. Yeah, you should. Well, that's actually pretty good, but we wanted Studs Place because that's what we're talking about.
This is improv, by the way, sir.
This is improv.
Right. Go ahead.
Studs Place. Studs was the owner of Studs Place. He would sit and talk to the staff of Studs Place. It was a greasy diner kind of barbecue joint. Studs would sit there and chat with his staff, who were actors, musicians, and one was a opera singer. And then he'd have a weekly guest, a special guest each week. And this is how he would do his interviews for that show. And I'm going to tell you a real quick history that I'm going to improvise. In 1949, Studs Place was a segment of another show called Saturday Night Square. Not to be confused with Saturday Night Live or Hollywood Squares. It was its own show. I'm sure most of you have seen it. That was part of that show, and it was set in a tavern. However, the next year, in 1950, it became its own show, and they changed it to a barbecue joint. Studs would sit around, talk to the waitress and the cooks, and then they'd have the special guests come in.
Who saw that show? Anybody see that show? Who said, oh yeah? You saw that show? Oh,
And then
you're old, sir. You're old.
And in 1951, that went to ABC, and it was promptly canceled. Some people say because he was blacklisted. We won't talk about that right now.
We're going to move on.
We're going to talk about good things about him.
Can somebody give me an activity? Biking. I heard biking.
Biking, that's a good activity.
That's a good activity. Thank you very much.
Let's not worry about that. Let's do a quote from Look magazine.
Yeah.
Now, Studs Place was kind of one of the original shows that was in the Chicago School of Television.
Anybody know what the Chicago School of Television is? I don't need applause. I want to know what it is. Somebody tell me what it is.
I do, right here. Okay. There's a quote from Look magazine on Chicago School of Television. It's been called relaxed, intimate, friendly, natural, subtle. But the main thing about the Chicago School of TV, more widely copied in higher priced, higher pressured areas, is this. The viewer doesn't know what's going to happen next, and next, and next. And we're about that. We're about improvisation. We're about what's going to happen next. And that adds a certain amount of spontaneity to the performance. Now, the Chicago School of Television, Steve, you want to tell them a little bit about who was involved in that?
We have, I'm just going to improvise this. Dave Garraway, anyone see Garraway at large? Remember that? You, sir, you didn't raise your hand. You raised your hand. There you go. Good. Kukla, Fran, and Ollie? Yeah!
They know that one.
Too many youngsters out there know that one. And Marlon Perkins. He had a show called the Zoo Parade. Do you remember him? But do you remember?
But the most important one of all.
The most it was Studs Place.
And scene. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Happy birthday, Studs.
Again, the Drinking and Writing Theater is housed in the Haymarket Pub at the corner of Halsted and Randolph. They are responsible for those of you who are half smashed now and are stuffed with some kind of sandwiches there. Keep your eyes on these guys. The bar itself, I'm not big on beer, but the bar itself seems like a really nice place. And they have other kinds of liquor there, too. Before we move on, there are a lot of notable people out in this crowd, a lot of friends of mine. I'm only going to introduce two. Great friends of Studs and Ida's. Gary Wills, one of the most prolific, intelligent writers ever, is sitting right there. And sometimes when I was with Studs and Ida and Gary, I really got the feeling that Ida would look at Gary and look at Studs and say, Jesus, I made a terrible mistake marrying this guy. She loved Gary. The other is a person I have revered almost my whole life, a man who has always fought for the right thing at some personal cost. He's the guy who convinced Studs to have a heart operation when he was 93, and when I called Studs in the hospital, he didn't do the operation. He said, Rick, I go, how you feeling? He says, Rick, I'm a medical miracle. One of the giants of this city, Dr. Quentin Young. Which leads almost perfectly into our next guest. Studs would be appalled over the last few years and continuing about the union bashing that goes on in this country, the utter lack of respect paid to workers and teachers. No one has fought harder in my life in Chicago for labor unions than our next guest, ladies and gentlemen, Ed Sadlowski.
I waited for him after he was over and took him on the side and introduced myself and told him, you know, that how much I liked his writing. And at that time, Studs had 3 or 4 books that had been printed. Good books. And we got to chatting. And the next time I met Terkel, he actually asked about my kid. And my kid didn't know who the hell I was talking about when I talked about Terkel, but Terkel, for the next 40-some years, asked about my kid. And they became very close friends. Went to ball games together. Studs was really a Sox fan at heart. He, ooh, and ooh. So, yeah. No, but I think a lot of that was attributable to Bill Vick, who was a beer drinker and used to hang out at Miller's with Terkel on occasion and drink beer and talk about baseball. And I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure of that. That's one that I'm not sure of. Relating to baseball, Terkel and myself were at Sox Park the day the White Sox clinched the division championship. And that was I guess, in the 60s, mid-60s. And Reinsdorf at that stage had purchased the team a few years before. And we drank a lot of beer, sat in the bleachers. He would sit nowhere else if he had the choice. And he would kibitz about baseball all day long, sitting there with whoever wanted to listen or to gab, or I remember this guy, I remember that guy. Like you were kids sitting on a street curb in the summer in Chicago passing a quart of root beer around, you know. And who was your favorite player, and you got so good at it, you knew the shoe ties of what the guy was wearing, you know. That was baseball fans. I go to ballparks today, and you've got 3 yuppie-type characters. It just paid $50 a ticket at scalp prices and bragged about it. And every time I'd see somebody do that, I'd think about my pa and say, you know, Jesus Christ, my $50 ticket. And Terkel would, same thing. He refused to do something like that, you know. They were purists at their own heart, captured by their own heart. Well, this particular game that they had clinched the pennant, we had drank a lot of beer. And leaving the park, we run into, at that time, the commissioner of baseball, Louis Kuhn. And Terkel started, you know, rumbling to me on the side. That no good, dirty son. And then guys that recognized Studs on the street corner, you know, stopped to listen to what he was saying. And we kind of overstayed our welcome, I guess, on the corner because somebody that was out of the Andy Frayne Usher, no, it wasn't Andy had sold that business, of the crowd patroller, or whatever they called him, you know, came over and asked us, you know, kind of cool it, keep it down, you know, a lot of people around, inciting a riot possibly, and So we had went down on the elevated, I remember, and got off at 35th Street and walked over. Now that's the old park now. It was there. It was there. And as we left the vicinities of the ballpark, we had to find a saloon because we had drank a lot of beer. And now, most of you remember Sox Park as it was laid out. There was about 2 or 3 saloons on 35th Street, and that was basically it. Within a 2-block area or so, that there was not, no kind of action at all on the street. So I said to him, well, can't get in that one, can't get in that one. Come on, I know a parking lot about a block down, and belongs to the Kent College of Law at the time, or IIT, I should say, not the College of Law. So Studs and myself went down underneath the elevated tracks, and we're leaning against one of the structural poles, and here comes racing through the parking lot a Chicago squad car with the light flashing, and Studs is fumbling all over himself, and I'm sure 90-year-old guy or 80-year-old guys at the time would usually find themselves in the same predicament. And the cop jumps out the squad door and starts screaming at us, What the hell do you call yourself doing here? And Studs is fumbling around. And I'm thinking to myself, Studs had just received I believe it was the Pulitzer, the week before. And I'm thinking to myself, headlines tomorrow, Chicago Tribune. Noted author caught pissing on a girder, and I remember this. He was the best of the best of the best.
Jesus, even I don't have a Studs pissing story. Studs met Lucy Parsons. I hope that name means something to you. As if back from the dead, ladies and gentlemen, Lucy Parsons.
Thank you very much. It seems a bit strange to be inside this building. I'm usually out there in Bughouse Square on the soapbox, speaking freely about any issue that I felt was necessary on that day. And I kind of miss it because there are a lot of issues going on right now, like the mayor. Oh, and then there's the teachers and the nurses and the nuns and NATO. Oh, but wait. I digress. I'm not here today to talk about that. Today is Louis Studs Terkel's day. That's the topic for today. Now, you know that Studs was not born in Chicago. He was not a native. He was born in New York, and he moved here when he was about 8 or 9 years old. But she made Chicago his home. Now, he received that name Studs from the Studs Lonergan stories that James Farrell had written. And he was in a production, and the director had 2 actors there by the first name of Louis. So he decided to give Terkel the name of his character, which was Studs, and it stuck with him. Now, Studs was one of the founding members of the Chicago AFTRA Union. I mean, at that time, it was called American Federation of Radio Artists, and then it was changed to American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. Well, he joined in 1937, and he remained an actor in that union until he died. And then he also was a member of the Screen Actors Guild. Very active. He served on the AFTRA's boards for the early years. He represented Chicago as a delegate to all the national conventions. He was a union man. And as a guest speaker of AFTRA's annual membership meeting, Studs helped celebrate the union's 60th anniversary. And he told about how he got started in the early years as an actor on radio. And he said, I was usually a gangster and only occasionally got to play the hero. But in describing the industry, he said, without AFTRA, would there have been residuals? Of course not. Minimum scale and established hours? Of course not. You were nothing. You were told you were lucky to have a job, and then came AFTRA to help us stand up. Well, he stood up. In July 2000, he stood up with the local SAG and AFTRA members when they were fighting for a fair contract with the producers of the television commercials. Studs was 88 years old then, and he testified before Mayor Daley and the council, representing more than 100 AFTRA and SAG members who were there to support him. He explained the importance of commercial acting in Chicago, and that resulted in a resolution being passed and to support the striking actors, urging the advertising industry to resolve the labor dispute and not to make those outrageous pay cuts. Well, he was, as I said, pro-union, and I'm sure he would have been happy to know that just a few weeks ago, there was a merger, and the two unions, AFTRA and SAG, became SAG-AFTRA. So let's have a round of applause for that. But there's something else that Studs was very fascinated with, the history of Chicago. Oh, especially the Haymarket tragedy. He read everything he could find about it. And since May 1st has just occurred, it brings back memories, yeah, of the great 8-hour parade down Michigan Avenue, and the 2 days later how the bomb was thrown over there in the midst of a protest meeting that was at Randolph and Des Plaines Avenue, and how the innocent men were arrested, Albert Parsons being one of them. Then came the farce of a trial and the executions. But we must remember that my dear Albert and his comrades died for labor. And that's what Studs was all about, too. He was such a labor man, and he had great interest in those stories, and he liked to talk about them. I was told about an evening on his radio show when Bill Edelman, who, you know, could talk for days, and so could Studs, and they were guests there along with one other person, and between the two of them, the other guests hardly had a chance to say anything. But it was wonderful to hear, they tell me, Studs talk about the Haymarket, and he was just up on all aspects of it. But he was touched by a letter that Albert had written to our children from jail the night before he was executed. So I thought it would be appropriate today to read that letter. Dungeon number 7, Cook County Jail, Chicago, Illinois, November 9, 1887. To my precious, darling little children, Albert R. Parsons, Jr., and his sister, Luda Ida Parsons. As I write this word, I blot your names with a tear. We never meet again. Oh, my children, how deeply, dearly your papa loves you. We show our love by living for our loved ones. We also prove our love by dying when necessary for them. Of my life and the cause of my unnatural and cruel death, you will learn from others. Your father is a self-offered sacrifice upon the altar of liberty and happiness. To you, I leave the legacy of an honest name and duty done. Preserve it, emulate it. Be true to yourselves. You cannot then be false to others. Be industrious, sober, and cheerful. Your mother, she is the grandest, noblest of women. Love, honor, and obey her. My children, my precious ones, I request you to read this parting message on each recurring anniversary of my death in remembrance of him who died not alone for you, but for the children yet unborn. Bless you, my darlings. Farewell, your father, Albert R. Parsons.
that wasn't really Lucy Parsons. She'd be really, really old now. That's the great Alma Washington, who has done this, who has done similar things at the Bughouse Square debates and literally moved me to tears about that injustice. John Langford is not from Chicago, but then again, neither was Studs. John, I know, feels the influence and shadow of Studs. Studs enriches him in the same way that his words and his art and his music enrich Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, John Langford.
This is a bit of an experiment. I never met Studs Terkel, but I heard him a lot on WBEZ, where he was constantly talking in the corner of my painting studio. Thanks to Alison Cuddy, because she dug out this interview that he did. 2 days after 9/11, Studs came on the radio and actually kind of predicted what was going to go down. And it was an amazing piece of sort of analysis, completely off the cuff. But he talked about which road America could take in those days after 9/11. And he unfortunately predicted which way they would go. And the words to this song, which I wrote yesterday afternoon, they're Studs Terkel's words, and it's his phrasing and his rhythms and cadence, but I stole the tune from somewhere, so. And I'm going to play it on a ukulele because it makes me look much larger than I really am. Talking on the radio just days after it happened, Studs Terkel's asked what it is that just happened. After 60 years of perpetual war, the USA is an impregnable fortress no more. No, it's not Pearl Harbor. No, it's not World War II. We've always gone somewhere else to fight. Count the wars, now count the years. This is the first time we've seen the harder here. Studs Terkel quotes Einstein, Time Mag cover boy, the man of the century, the one time they chose to get right. Since Hiroshima, since the atom was split, the world has changed irrevocably, except for the way that we think. Studs Terkel says, we are not Rome. We pretend to do good as we conquer and bomb. George Bush says, go get 'em. It's black and it's white, my country. Wrong or right? Studs Terkel says, not everything our government does is right. Honest dissent must only enrich us. When we question authority, no matter how righteous, what if it's wrong? Let's set it right. Studs Terkel says we have national Alzheimer's disease. No memory of the past. We learn no lessons from history. Thank you.
As much as I admire John, I even admire more. I Like a High. I wrote that yesterday. It's a beautiful song, John. One of the aspects of all of this celebratory thing about Studs is that Jane Addams Hull House Museum, because there is no longer a Hull House, thank you very much, big check writers of Chicago, came up with a way for all of us, everybody in Chicago, to participate in this Studs celebration. Heather Radke of Hull House is going to come up here and share some of the recordings from the Studs Terkel hotline.
Hi, everyone. There are so many of you. I have to admit I'm quite nervous, but I came up with this idea with Paul to celebrate Studs in two different ways. One is to both have a chance for all of us who, well, I didn't know him, but all of you who did know him, to have a moment where you could reflect and actually have your stories recorded. But also for those of us who didn't know him, to me, listening is actually a radical and revolutionary act, and it's something that Studs, as much, I mean, I've heard all of you say that Studs was he was as chatty as much as he was a listener, but I really believe, to me, his radical nature was that of a listener. And so I think one of the opportunities you have in this hotline is to actually call and leave a message about how listening has been important to you. So I made a little radio piece because I'm not only a museum professional, but I'm sort of an amateur radio producer. So you'll have to forgive the amateur nature of it as well, in which I put together three different stories that I got. They're actually all about Studs because it's his birthday, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to remember him. But I also want to give you guys a chance to call in. And I brought some flyers, but I did not bring enough flyers. So what I'm hoping is that I can tell you the phone number, and all of you who I know have your phones handy can actually just put it in your phone right now. And when I started this project, everyone keeps saying, like, I don't have a Stud story. And I say, no, you do. And all of you are here. And so I know you all do because he must have meant something to you. So the phone number is, are you all ready? All right, well, let me tell you one more thing when you get ready, which is that all of the stories from this project are going to actually end up here at the Newberry Library. The amazing and talented audio archivist here, Kelly Kress, is actually going to be taking them all and putting them into the collection for researchers in the future to use in whatever way they want to, including maybe at the 200th birthday, at which none of us will be at, but maybe your voices will be at it. Okay, so now you have to be ready. The number is 559-546-1661. Okay, one more time. You guys ready? 559-546-1661. You can also get the number on the Jane Addams Hull House Museum website, the Newberry's website, I think, and also the website of this event, which is the Studs Terkel Centenary Committee's event. So without further ado, I think we're going to play my piece. Okay.
Thank you for calling the Studs Terkel Centennial Celebration Hotline.
Studs Terkel was one of America's most memorable storytellers.
Although he hosted a radio show for over 45 years and wrote several books, his greatest talent was not in using his own voice to tell a story, but listening to others and providing a forum to broadcast their voices.
In that spirit, we're hoping for stories about listening and stories about Studs.
If you have an anecdote or story you would like to share about Studs, please tell us.
If you'd rather contribute by telling a story about listening, consider the question, when has listening closely changed the way you thought about the world?
I've been planning to go to the Republican National Convention in Minneapolis as a protester. And I went without any intention of getting arrested, but to register my dissent against the Republican Party and the policies that they were pursuing at the time and continue to pursue. And to make a long story short, I somehow, along with about 800 other people, ended up getting swept up and arrested. And so I ended up in jail, and they're trying to hold us as long as they could, I assume because they didn't want us to return back to the streets. So I ended up spending a total of about 48 hours in jail. And I later found out that this was not a common experience for other people who were arrested, but in my cell block, we had a book cart. No one else that I've talked to who was arrested there had a book cart, but we did. I was lucky. And we were kept in our cells for all but 1 hour during those, for each 24-hour period. And I went out to look at the book cart, and It's mostly, strangely, kids' books. There were, like, I remember Chronicles of Narnia being there. And I'm, just sort of going through the card, not expecting to find anything. And then all of a sudden, I see a red, beat-up paperback copy of Working by Studs Terkel. Incredibly, the same book that I was reading when I left to come to the Republican National Convention. It's sitting there in the book cart. So, of course, I grab it. I take it back to my cell. I'm in jail. I don't have anything else to do. So all I do for the next 48 hours is sleep, eat some really crappy food, and read Working by Studs Terkel. And I remember somebody had written in pencil in the beginning of the book, I'd rather work all of the shitty jobs described in this book than spend a day in Ramsey County Jail, which is where we work.
Hi, this is Jamie O'Reilly. I'm a singer and an activist in Chicago, and I first appeared on Studs' show in the early 80s at WFMT, talking about a musical that I was performing around the country on the right to work. And he said what he famously said to so many others, this is good stuff. And he was good stuff. He became my great friend, and I was honored to be able to sing for him several times before he passed away. His favorite song that I sang was Annie Laurie, and it was partly because it was what Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket martyrs, sang, as the story goes, the night before he died. But by the end, it was really Studs himself, an elf and a giant of a man who filled my heart and fills my heart today. So we always will remember him and the tremendous, tremendous effect he had on our lives. Thank you, Studs.
When I found out that Studs had died, I was working at the Chicago Underground Film Festival. Someone came in and said, Studs just died. They said soon after, maybe like a few hours later, that on his gravestone it said, this cat didn't die out of curiosity. I never found out if it was true, because I didn't want it not to be.
That's very nice work. Maybe you'd get a job in radio. But public radio, they don't pay. Once more, these beautiful, lovely maps are available for $10. Bucky has some CDs, not many, but just a few CDs for $15. John, you didn't bring anything, did you? Because you're the same kind of business person I am. Please do that. In 1989, I was hired by the Tribune to be their TV critic. In 1989, a week after they hired me as TV critic, they said, you know Studs Terkel, don't you? Yes, my whole life. Well, we have an obituary of Studs that we'd like you to start to polish. I said, he's 77 years old. What are you talking about? That's newspaper's way. I don't polish him. I just sat there until Studs wound up dying. 2 weeks after I got the assignment to polish Studs' obituary, my father died. There was a memorial service right here in this room. I don't know if any of you were there. Studs spoke at that. Years later, it's 2001, and because Studs is going to turn 90 the next year, I'm assigned to write a Tribune magazine cover story about his 90th birthday. I spent 3 solid weeks with him over that time just because I enjoyed it. That's more time than you actually need to write a profile of someone you've known forever. But we went places and had fun. The last night before I would go in to sit down to write, we were at Ricardo's. Studs got a ride home from Tony Judge, and I walked thinking about my father. Studs' friend for decades. Studs' friend when they were both young, before the books, before the radio show, before the fame, before the Studs that most people know. My father, as I said, had died 13 years before, but had he lived, he would have been the same age as Studs. and I found myself wishing he were still around for many reasons. But on this night, while I was walking to help explain to me what made Studs Studs, I went home, and later I found an old paper with a review that my father had written of Studs' book, Talking to Myself. It appeared in the April 9th, 10th, 1977 issue of Panorama, the section my father started for the bygone Daily News. It's a rave, as they say in the critic biz. He called the book extraordinary and remarkable. But I was looking for something more personal, observations that might echo through the years. I found them in the 4th and 5th paragraphs. My dad wrote, "Here, sure enough, is the real Studs, the genuine article, as vibrant in print as he is in life. Exhilarating, amazingly observant, inquisitive, deflator of the pompous and the powerful, and uplifter of the gifted and the oppressed, at times disputatious, and at times shying away from confrontations. Superbly talented as performer and narrator and interviewer, asking questions of everyone and of himself, and evoking revealing answers, rarely lingering over woes that may have befallen him, but ardent in his ire about injustices heaped on others, spirited, buoyant, and acutely aware of the comic and ridiculous aspects of our existence, and incessantly bursting with excitement and exuberance." That may not be the definitive word, but right now, for me in this room, that'll do. And now, the guy you've all been waiting for, Studs Terkel. You know, if Studs had trouble with a tape recorder, imagine how befuddled he would be by this kind of thing.
Studs Terkel has spent his life listening to other people's stories and passing them on. It has been his way of encountering the world. He's written 16 books, many of them oral histories, like The Good War, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 1985. We wanted to turn the microphone on him to hear the story of his beliefs. Here he is, recorded in his apartment the day before he entered the hospital for heart surgery at age 93.
My own beliefs, my personal beliefs, came into being during the most traumatic moment in American history, the Great American Depression of the 1930s. I was 17 at the time, and I saw on the sidewalks pots and pans and bedsteads and mattresses. A family had just been evicted, and there was an individual cry of despair, multiplied by millions. But that community had a number of people on that very block who were electricians and plumbers and carpenters, and they appeared that same evening of the eviction, and moved these household goods back into the flat where they had been. They turned on the gas, they fixed the plumbing. It was a community in action, accomplishing something. And this is my belief, too, that it's the community in action that accomplishes more than the individual does, no matter how strong he may be. Einstein once observed that Westerners have a feeling individual loses his freedom if he joins, say, a union or any group. Precisely the opposite's the case. The individual discovers his strength as an individual because along the way discovered others share his feelings. He is not alone. And thus a community is formed. You might call it the prescient community or the prophetic community. It's always been there. And I must say, it has always paid its dues, too. The community of the 30s and the 40s and the Depression, fighting for rights of labor and the rights of women and the rights of all people who are different from the majority, always paid their dues. But it was their presence as well as their prescience that made for our whatever progress we have made. And that's what Tom Paine meant when he said, freedom has been hunted round the globe. Reason was considered as rebellion. The slavery of fear made men afraid to think. But such is the irresistible nature of truth that all it asks, all it wants, is the liberty of appearing. In such a situation, man becomes what he ought to be, still quoting Tom Paine. He sees his species not with the inhuman idea of a natural enemy. You're either with us or against us now. He sees his species as kindred. And that happened to be my belief. And I'll put it in 3 words: community and action.
Composed.
I want to thank you all for coming. I want to tell you to go out this weekend in particular and be inspired by what has happened here. Democracy in action is a wonderful thing. It's messy, and it should be loud, and we should be a part of that, following his example. We also have to thank the Haymarket people for the free booze. Who's We have to thank, of course, the Newberry Library, in particular Rachel Bowman and Kelly McGrath. Paul DeRica for pulling this thing together. Tony Judge for keeping the Studs flame alive with stuff going on all year. All of you Studs friends and admirers and the performers and speakers who've come up here, you gotta, he and I are lying under the dirt of that tree across the way, and I'm sure they would say this too: I love you.